Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our virtual conference session for Call 2020. I'm Eric Way on behalf of LexisNexis. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you to Shauna, Karen, Michael, and the Conference Planning Committee for organizing all of this on such short notice. I know we were all planning to be gathering in person in Hamilton and enjoying each other's company. Obviously, the lunches and all the microbrewery tours we had planned will have to wait for another day. I do hope that you're all doing well, personally and professionally, during what is definitely an extraordinary year for everybody. Thanks for finding time in your day as we all adjust to this brave new world of working from our kitchens and bedrooms, welcoming virtual summer students, and sending and resending passwords to all your lawyers. We had all of those challenges in mind in choosing our topic for today, training and supporting lawyers working virtually. There have been a lot of interesting conversations as our LexisNexis trainers have worked with you and your firm, schools, legal departments over the past couple of months, and we wanted to address those challenges directly. So just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We are hosting a large audience today in this new and slightly awkward video conference format. If you do experience any technical difficulties, the first thing we suggest is to simply exit the meeting and to re-enter it using the link that you joined from. If you would like to submit a question during the presentation, we encourage you to do so using the online chat box. And please do stay with us for a few minutes following the conclusion of Chris's talk, as we will be holding an online raffle. Everyone here will have a chance to win one of 4 $100 gift cards as just a small thank you from us. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Chris Graham. Chris is the founder and principal of TellPeople, a vehicle for teaching storytelling and communication for professionals. TellPeople helps lawyers in Canada and the US talk about their ideas in ways that clients understand and find compelling. Chris himself has been a lawyer twice, first at Sullivan and Cromwell in New York, and again at Pape Salter LLP in Toronto. He was educated at the University of Oxford, University of Toronto, Acadia University. He is also a proud graduate of the Second City in stand-up comedy, and his education as a storyteller and comedian continues on stages around Toronto, maybe not right now, but eventually. A cause near and dear to Chris's heart is Camp Ooch, where he is a volunteer counselor and fundraiser at a camp for young cancer patients. So Chris, welcome, thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Eric. Thanks to all of you for being here today. I know there are literally dozens of webinars that you can choose from right now. And I'm very grateful that you've chosen to spend some time here with us this afternoon. Thanks, of course, to LexisNexis for sponsoring. Thanks to Eric and his team for coordinating all of the logistics that made it possible for me to be here with you today. You know, it's kind of funny how things work out. As Eric mentioned, I used to be a lawyer. And so I've had lots of encounters with law librarians, both as a law student and as a young associate. Which means in the course of my career, I have been on the receiving end of enormous generosity and wisdom and patience from members of this community. And you know, I was thinking about it today. I was very grateful for this at the time, but it's only now, with like 15 years removed from the cauldron of anxiety and stress that is, you know, law school and being a young associate, that I feel like I can fully appreciate the scope of support that I received from law librarians, members of this community. So I'm very grateful to just be here today and be able to say thank you to all of the law librarians that have helped me in my career, and to make this tiny contribution to the very good work that you all are doing. So with that by way of introduction, let me start by telling you what's going to happen for the next 45 minutes, give or take, how we're going to use our time. So what we're going to do today is try and make each of you a little bit better at training lawyers working virtually. And that includes, as Eric said, the sort of existing lawyers that you have that are working from home all of a sudden during quarantine, but it also includes perhaps especially onboarding and training up summer students who are acclimating themselves both to your firm or your organization and to the practice of law generally. And the way we're going to try and make you better at virtual training is by talking about 4 things, and they're listed across the top of the screen. They'll be there the whole time. So the first thing we're going to talk about is access. What are the challenges that lawyers face accessing law firm resources from home? Then we're going to talk about content, and specifically the challenges that you face translating content you've developed for a live audience into something that works for a virtual audience. Next, we're going to talk about delivery, which is the challenge that you face personally as a trainer trying to perform for a live audience. And the last thing we're going to talk about is engagement, how to get people to ask you questions and engage with your material outside of the office. Okay, so that's where we're going to go today. Let me tell you now how we're going to get there. For each of these topics, we're going to spend about 10 minutes talking about various issues. And for most of that time, I'm just going to tell you stories that I think illustrate the key points I'd like for you to take away. And hopefully the stories will make it easy to remember the point. At 2 points during the session today, once near the beginning and once at the end, we're going to do an exercise. It's a very simple exercise, 3 minutes for self-reflection essentially on everything we've learned in the session up to that point. During the exercises, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the chat and I'm going to read all of the questions that people have submitted. So as Eric said, at any point if you have a question, fire it into the chat. I'm going to read them during the exercises, and then after each exercise, I'll come back, answer a few questions, given the context, and then we'll carry on with the session. All right. So all of that will take about 45 minutes, and at the end of that, as Eric said, he's going to come back and essentially give away free money and thereby steal all of the thunder from what I have just said in the last 45 minutes. Okay, so last thing I want to flag for people before we get started is it's very possible some of what you're about to hear today will seem at first a little bit obvious. And the reason it's going to seem obvious is that all of you are very smart. You're all very experienced trainers of lawyers. And so what I want to flag for you is if anything does seem to be a bit obvious to you, at least at first, instead of rolling your eyes and checking out your attention, what I'd like for you to do instead is think about this photo on the screen. I'm sure some people have been wondering what's up with the photo. So that's a picture of me, circa 2012, and that is my real hair. Yeah, I'm performing something called Tackle Me for $1. So Tackle Me for $1 is essentially what it sounds like. You take the sign, you go to a park, and you charge people $1 to tackle you. It's like a performance art project. It's very fun and very painful. We made $36 that day. Just imagine what must have been involved in that. So what's interesting about Tackle Me for $1 is that while almost everybody knows what tackling means, right? So just think to yourself, you know what a tackle is, yeah. So it turns out very few people actually know how to tackle. And so what happens is they pay their money and they get opposite me, and then they do all of this weird non-tackling stuff. So this woman, for example, just pushed me over, right? That's not a tackle. This woman jumped on my back. That's a penalty in football. And this woman pretended to go to the bathroom on my chest, which is disgusting. Yeah, also not a tackle. These are all stills from a video, actually. After the session, if you want, you can look it up on YouTube. It's very fun. What Tackle Me for $1 illustrates is the difference between theory and practice. Right? Knowing how to do something in theory is not at all the same as being good at doing that thing. And of course, the only way to get good at doing something is to practice. Now, this is obviously true for tackling, but it is equally true for the skills required to train lawyers working virtually. I've talked to a lot of people who do professional development, and they have all said that the last 3 months have been incredibly challenging. And it seems to me the reason for that challenge is that very few people have any practice or a lot of practice training people in their homes. And added to this, the people you're training also have no practice in being trained in their homes. And so at least for me, the last 3 months have felt kind of like being tackled over and over again by people who don't know how to tackle. So what I would like for us to do today with our session is a kind of deliberate practice. We're going to think through very carefully some of the specific challenges that you face in translating your considerable knowledge and experience of training people live, and what sort of arises when you shift that into the virtual space. And after the session, I can't promise you that there will be no more tackles, but I think it's fair to say there will be far fewer tackles. Yeah. All right, so let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is the challenges that people face accessing law firm resources from home. And the way we're going to learn about these challenges is by talking about a fictional summer associate called Jonah. That's a picture of Jonah on the screen. Now, Jonah is a made-up person, but he's actually based on a real person. So I mentor a lot of kids at U of T, where I went to law school. And one of the guys that I mentor, he summered at a big law firm downtown a couple of years ago. You can see there's Jonah down at the bottom, having his summer associateship. And I was talking to him like a month after quarantine, and we were thinking about how much different that experience was compared to what must be happening this year. So I thought we would think through the challenges that Jonah would face if he was starting his summer associateship right now. So let's join Jonah in his childhood bedroom. So Jonah lives with his parents because law school is expensive. And his parents live in a home. It's about a 15-minute walk from Kipling Station, which is the station at the far west end of the Bloor subway line. Now, during the summer, Jonah's parents work during the day out of the house, but Jonah's brother is also home from university. His summer job doesn't start until July, so he is home in the house with Jonah. So 9 a.m. on Monday morning, the first day of Jonah's summer associate tenure, he logs into his first ever video conference. And he sees the head of the firm's summer associate program partner welcoming the summer associates. Jonah watches the video conference for about 15 minutes, at which point his brother charges into the bedroom, screaming that whatever Jonah is doing on the computer is hogging all of the bandwidth in the home's internet, and his brother can't even check his email, right? Now, it's at this moment that Jonah realizes he should have muted the microphone on his laptop. And so his brother's diatribe has been broadcast to all of the summer associates, including the partner leading the meeting. The partner has to lean into the microphone and say, "Jonah, do you mind turning yours off?" Jonah is mortified. He's also flustered because his brother is yelling at him. And he has no idea how to mute his microphone because this is his first ever video conference. So in a huff, he just slams down the lid of his laptop. Whew, hard day for Jonah already. So let's check in on 3 enormous challenges that we've already encountered, right? So the first challenge that Jonah faces is bandwidth. The internet connection at Jonah's home is not sufficient for him to work from home when somebody else is also trying to work from home, right? How is he going to resolve this challenge? Okay. We're going to aggregate all of the challenges, and then we'll talk about what to do in a second. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is etiquette. Jonah doesn't know, he's never been on a video conference, so he doesn't know that the etiquette on video conference is to mute your mic when you're not otherwise speaking. He also doesn't know how to do that. So even if you announced at the beginning of the call, "Please everybody mute your mic," Jonah wouldn't know what to do. And then the third sort of interesting issue is confidentiality, right? It's probably the case that the welcome talk isn't very confidential, but what happens when Jonah starts doing client work? Does he have to lock himself in his own bedroom so that his brother can't come in? An actual example of this are friends of mine who are a husband and wife team. They're both lawyers, but they work at different firms. And one of the first things they had to figure out during quarantine was, were they actually able to work at the same table in their own home? Or did they have to sequester themselves all day at different ends of their condo? Right? So these are interesting challenges. Now, Jonah is very resourceful. So he very quickly negotiates with his brother, who's a good guy, who agrees to take off for the day. Jonah logs back in to the video conference. He continues watching for about 20 minutes, at which point his laptop crashes because the laptop is so old, it can't handle modern video conference software. And you might think, how is it possible that this is the case? Well, Jonah is a poor law student. He hasn't gotten a new laptop since the beginning of undergrad, right? So it's 6 years old at this point. And in fact, Jonah actually does most of his computer work on the computers at the law school, so he doesn't have to lug his machine back and forth the hour commute each way during the year. Right? So Jonah has a very old laptop. It's not clear what he should do with that. But again, he's very resourceful. So 10 minutes later, he gets out his phone, which is a much more current model, downloads Zoom onto his phone, and logs back into the video conference using his phone, just in time to hear the firm's head of IT say, "You're not allowed to conduct any firm business over your personal mobile phone." Oof, which hurts Jonah. But the real challenge for Jonah will come several hours later during the part of the session where they log in for the first time to the firm's secure server, which is Citrix. And Jonah discovers that Citrix also crashes his laptop. Oof, that is a tough day for Jonah. So this is a summary of the types of challenges that Jonah faces. And I think that these challenges will be analogous to or equal to the challenges that a lot of your lawyers are facing. And I'm sure there are some additional access challenges that I haven't listed here. So I think there are two ways to think about your response to these challenges. The first is advanced planning, right? So what this means is you want to use your imagination to identify all of these challenges and then to figure out what's your organization's policy in response to the challenges, right? And a good way to figure out that policy or what it should be is to talk to your peers, right? Some of the people who are watching this session now. See what people are doing, but of course, bear in mind, for better or worse, there's not going to be any silver bullet response, right? Every organization is different. So for example, some organizations will just buy Jonah a laptop, right? For lots of other organizations, there's no way that's possible. And so what I want to suggest to you is the specific response is less important than having a response, having a policy and letting Jonah know what the policy is so that he can start to respond. Because what's stressful for a person like Jonah or the lawyers in your organization is not so much the challenge itself, it's when the challenge comes as a surprise. Yeah. Now, it's totally fair if what you're thinking is, you know, this is great, Chris, but it would have been helpful if we heard this 4 months ago, right? And of course that's true, but here's the other thing to note. People like Jonah tend not to be complainers. And so it is very possible that some of your summer associates and some of your existing lawyers are not telling you about the challenges that they face, right? You need to be actively soliciting those challenges. So another real life example of this is a friend of mine, different friend, who's also a lawyer. It turned out when he started working from home during quarantine that the only place in his home where the signal was strong enough for a video call was the bathroom. And so he spent the first week of quarantine practicing law from his toilet. Yeah. And then of course, a technician from Rogers or whatever came and upgraded the internet. Okay, so the point is, as you start to grapple with these questions, or as you continue to grapple with them, please make sure that your grappling includes asking your lawyers for the specific challenges that they face, right? So make sure you're asking people, where in your home do you do video calls? You might be very surprised by the response that some people give you. Yeah. Okay, let's do a quick exercise. And the exercise is very simple. We're going to take 3 minutes. And what I want you to do is just make some notes, wherever you're sitting, on a piece of paper, of your organization's policy around some of the following issues, right? Bandwidth challenges, technology, video conference etiquette, who teaches that, how do you deal with confidentiality issues, and any other issues that you face that I haven't mentioned. All right, so just make a couple of notes about your organization's policy. And if you don't know the policy, or if there isn't one, make a few notes on what you think maybe it should be. We're gonna take 3 minutes to do this. So I'll come back after 3 minutes and then answer some questions and carry on with the session. All right, and we're back. Hi. So if you can, start to bring your attention back to the screen. And as we do that, I'm going to answer some of the questions that people sent in on the chat. And we had two in particular that were highly relevant. Actually, there were a bunch, but I'll just summarize them with these examples. So one question that somebody asked was, what do you do if your technology fails midway through the session? Which is my nightmare every day. It's a great question. And I think the answer to this is you deal with it in the same way you might deal with like a fire alarm going off in the middle of a regular presentation, right? So let's say you're doing a training at the office and the fire alarm goes off, so everybody just leaves the building, and then they come back and you carry on with the training, which is with as much time as left, right? And I think you treat sort of a virtual breakdown in the same way you would treat that situation. Something else you can do is what Eric did at the beginning of this session, which is if you're very nervous about something breaking, you can just announce to people what they should do, right? So if your technology fails, right, and it crashes on your end, you can say, you know, please everybody just log in again after 5 minutes. And for any individuals that get booted out of the webinar for any reason, they can just log in at their leisure or as soon as it's possible and let people know if anything sort of critical happened while they were away, you'll follow up with them directly at the end of the session. So that's what I would do there. That's a great question. The other question somebody asked, which is really interesting, is what is your preferred platform, like webinar platform, and why? This is a great question. Although I have to say, I think I'm not the best person to ask about this because my situation, I think, is a bit different from the situation of the people on this webinar. So my job involves talking to lots of different organizations, which means my incentive is to be kind of platform agnostic, because I often don't have control over the software that my clients are using. That being said, if I had to pick, I would say Zoom is my favorite, simply because it's the one I've been using the longest, long before quarantine happened. It's also, at least for me, very intuitive. I'm not particularly tech savvy, and some of my clients aren't particularly tech savvy, and they seem to be able to like point and click their way into the sessions with reasonable ease. So that's why I like Zoom. I think what I would say is a good person to ask that question is your colleagues. So, you know, other people who are on this session. I think tomorrow there's some sort of like virtual cocktail party or something. So maybe a cocktail party conversation might be what's your favorite software and why? But these are really great questions. Thanks so much for submitting them. Please continue to put them into the chat, and after we do the next exercise towards the end of the session, I'll answer some more of the questions. But for now, let's carry on. Hang on a sec while I get this working. There we go. To the next part of the session. So to recap briefly, we started by talking about some of the challenges that lawyers face accessing firm resources or organization resources remotely. Now what we're going to talk about is the challenges you face in translating content that was developed for a live audience into something that works for a virtual audience. And the way I think we can learn about these challenges is to continue thinking about our pal, Jonah. So let's imagine if Jonah was doing his summer associate training last year. He probably would have been in a boardroom that looked something like what you see on the screen, right? So what he would see is he would be sitting with a bunch of other summers and other lawyers, and they'd be looking at a trainer at the front of the room, and that trainer would be gesturing to PowerPoint or slide projectors, which would show different kinds of programs like PowerPoint, maybe you throw up a video, maybe a software demonstration, maybe you put up different websites, things like this. Now, when people think about how to translate live to virtual, a very common approach is to start with what happens in the live situation or the live space, and then try to recreate that as closely as possible in the virtual space, right? So that looks something like this. You take the live classroom and you try to put it on somebody's coffee table. And in theory, this is a good approach. Certainly, this is the approach that tech companies are working for, right? This is the dream of Microsoft Teams or Zoom or Blue Jeans or whatever software you're using. And to be honest, I think in a couple of years, maybe 10 years, we'll all have virtual reality glasses. So we can put it on and none of this will be an issue. The thing is, as we saw with Jonah's first day at Lawfirm or at the law experience, that reality is not happening today. And the reason it's not happening today is that it presumes all of the people in your organization have the best possible access to the best possible technology. Now, if that is the case at your organization, amazing, you can stop listening. But if that's not the case at your organization, I think what this means you need to do is you need to create training materials that work for the person who has the worst access to the worst technology. In other words, you need to create content that works for people like Jonah, people who are accessing the training from their childhood bedroom. Yeah. So let's think about what that looks like. All right. And there are two sort of aspects we can think about. The first is the live setting, right? So Jonah, in a live training session, would be sitting in a classroom and he would see everybody else, and you, the trainer, could see him and all the other students. And that looks something like this on Zoom, right? A giant gallery of video faces. The challenge with this is that it consumes enormous amounts of bandwidth. In fact, it's probably this screen that caused Jonah's computer to crash in our original example, right? This takes a lot of bandwidth. So what's better for Jonah is if everybody on the call, including perhaps you, the trainer, turns off their camera. And that looks something like this. Which means, from a training perspective, what you want to be thinking is how can you develop training materials that work when nobody can see anybody else? Okay? A nice thing to imagine is if I was doing this training on a conference call, what would my materials need to look like? Or how would I need that training to go? Yeah, it's very challenging, but I think you can do it. And there's no wrong answer, right? There's no right or wrong answer. You just want to think through these challenges and what makes sense for you. So an obvious challenge in this case is interaction, right? In a live setting, Jonah can just put up his hand or look confused, and you can see it, and you can ask the question. If everybody has their camera turned off, that's impossible, right? Now, you could use technology, right? Maybe you could have a widget or an emoji, right? That's a function on Zoom. People can put an emoji up. But that presumes you as the trainer are comfortable using that kind of technology during your talk. The same is true for chat, right? It is possible to have people chat to put up questions live during the session, but a lot of people find it very distracting to have real-time questions scrolling across the screen as they're trying to teach, right? I'm not saying it's impossible to do that. I'm just saying it doesn't work for everyone. Certainly, it doesn't work for me, which is why this session doesn't have live Q&A. I just can't make it work, right? Again, there's not that one approach is better than the other. There's no silver bullet. The point is to think about what works for you as a trainer and then tell everybody that's what's going to happen. Okay, so that's the first sort of main issue with content, is dealing with nobody being able to see anybody else. The second main issue is the number of programs involved in delivering your training. So in a typical live session, right, you might cycle through multiple programs. So you're there talking to everybody, and you got some PowerPoint slides, then maybe you toggle over to a video, throw up a software demonstration, maybe cut to a bunch of web pages. And in a live demonstration in a room at your office, it's no problem to jump through all of these different programs. As you've probably already experienced doing webinars, it's a lot harder to do that in a webinar. I'm not saying it's impossible to toggle between PowerPoint and Word, PowerPoint and a video, PowerPoint and software, but the reality is every time you toggle between programs, that's an opportunity for something to go wrong. So how do we deal with this reality, right? You want to ask yourself, do I really need multiple programs to deliver my training? Or in other words, you want to ask yourself, what is the minimum viable content that will get my message across? Right? And again, there's no right or wrong answer here, but let me give you two examples of what this might look like. Right? So the first example is, let's say you have a training for how to use the library's catalog and various resources on the library's page at your organization. Right? And it's possible that traditionally you have a PowerPoint presentation with some slides, then you jump over to the software or the page and you show some demos and you cut back and forth. Right? So in a virtual environment, what you want to ask yourself is, does that training session really require a PowerPoint intro? Or can you just load up the software or load up the page and do the entire thing as a demo, right? Because that's less programs to worry about. And if you really think it is the case that people need some sort of like prefatory information, maybe you can send that to them as a pre-read via email, right? Further simplifying things. So that's one example of how to think through. Another example might be if you give demos on how to use certain web pages like CDAR. That was a big thing when I was going through practicing law, right? Showing people how to access securities filings online. And so your typical presentation might be, again, a bunch of slides, and then you jump over to the CDAR page and you do a bunch of sample searches to show people how to find the documents that they need, right? But again, that requires multiple programs. And so you might ask yourself, do I really need all of those, right? And another alternative might be to have your normal PowerPoint presentation, and instead of jumping over to CDAR, taking screenshots of the relevant pages on CDAR and just pasting those into your PowerPoint, right? So you don't have to leave the program during the webinar. So for example, if you look at this Wall Street Journal screenshot that I have here on the page, that's an example of a screenshot, right? Just give it a cute little border, it'll look really great. So those are two ways to think through the issue, right? And again, the basic idea here is when you're doing virtual content, what is the minimum viable content that gets your message across? Okay, so I want to pause here and acknowledge that everything I've just said probably doesn't sound very exciting. My guess is that everybody who's watching this webinar works very hard to create the most dynamic and the most engaging content possible. And what I've just described to you, minimum viable content, probably goes against all of your instincts. And that probably feels frustrating. So I want to suggest two ways to respond to this frustration. The first thing to do is to think about the constraints of virtual learning as just different constraints for your creativity to overcome. So it's not that you can't be creative in the virtual space, it's just that you can't be creative in the ways that you're normally creative around training. So that's one way to think about the frustration. The other way to think about the frustration, or the other thing to do with those feelings, is just to acknowledge that virtual training is really frustrating, right? It's not just Jonah who misses out on the live environment, it's also you. I have never met a trainer who says, you know what would make my job better? If I could have the least possible contact with the people I'm trying to help. Nobody says that, right? And this is the third thing that I want to talk about with you, right? The challenges for you personally as a trainer trying to perform for a virtual audience, right? There are two challenges. One is it's disorienting, and the second is that it's emotionally draining. And they both have to do with this blank screen. So in honor of the challenges, I'm going to leave this screen up for the entire 10 minutes, just so we can all feel the challenge together. Okay, so we're going to talk about the challenges, and then I'll suggest some ways to deal with the challenge. So the first challenge of talking to a virtual audience is that it's disorienting. Until you've lost the ability to see the people you're talking to, it is hard to appreciate how important their feedback is, verbal or nonverbal, to keeping yourself oriented during a session. It's a bit like if you imagine standing on one foot, which I'm doing now, and then covering your eyes. You will immediately appreciate how much visual input is required to keep yourself standing upright. And the same is true for a live training session, right? People's feedback, especially nonverbal, tells you how your pacing is. It lets you know how your jokes are working. It lets you see in a person's face that they have a question, even if they don't raise their hand. Your laptop computer gives you none of those cues, right? So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is that talking to a camera is emotionally draining. A live audience is a source of energy for a presenter. Sometimes not a lot of energy, but always more than zero. And your laptop camera does none of that, right? Your laptop camera is like the worst relationship you've ever been in. It takes all the energy you give and returns nothing back to you. Yeah. So those are the challenges. How can we deal with those challenges, right? So I think there are two things that you can do. The first is that you can be much more scripted than you would normally be, right? So you need to write more notes in advance of your talk, right? So especially if you're a person who likes to wing it, just make a few bullet points and then talk to people. The reason you're able to do that is the people you're talking to give you all sorts of cues non-verbally about whether they're understanding, whether you should move along, etc., right? Your laptop camera will give you none of that information, which means the less scripted you are, the more likely you are to maunder on and on. Okay, a good way to think about this is that there is a reason news anchors read the news. Yeah. So that's the first thing. The second thing you can do, and this is going to sound a bit counterintuitive, is that you can stop paying attention to the audience. Yeah. Now, this is easy to do if everybody has their camera off, but even if they don't have their camera off, if you can see some faces, you should ignore those faces. And the reason is that people watching from home are incredibly distracting. They do all kinds of weird stuff, right? They like check email while you're talking. They listen while they look out the window. They talk to people who aren't on the screen. A lot of people play with their cats. I've experienced this a lot with people with cats. Perhaps the most curious thing that people do is they frown as they look at the screen, not because they're confused and have a question, but because it's really hard to look at a screen for long periods of time. Right? In other words, it is very challenging to read people's nonverbal cues in a virtual setting. And that challenge is amplified by the difficulty of checking in with people during a webinar. Right? I think you all know what I'm talking about. So the example is, let's say you're doing a webinar and some guy called Mike is staring at his screen looking confused. And so you say, Mike, you look confused. Do you have a question? And then it always takes a few seconds for him to realize you're talking to him and not the other Mike. Then he answers your question, but his mic's off, so you have to say, Mike, turn on your mic. So then he turns on his mic, and then he has to ask you to repeat the question because he wasn't paying attention because he was playing with his cat. And then you repeat the question, and you can see we've already wasted 10, 15, 20 seconds of the session, and he probably wasn't confused in the first place, right? It is very disruptive trying to interact with people on a large webinar. My advice to you is that juice is not worth the squeeze. Yeah. But that brings us, of course, to the last part of the session, which is maybe the most interesting. And that is engagement, right? How do you get people to answer your questions or engage with your material in a virtual setting? But before we get to that, let's just briefly recap what we've talked about so far. So we started by talking about access challenges faced by lawyers trying to access law firm content remotely. And then we talked about the challenges you face translating content that was developed for a live audience into something that works for a virtual audience. And we just talked about some of the challenges that you face as a trainer performing for a virtual audience and how that can be both disorienting and emotionally draining. And that brings us to the last issue, right? Which is, how do you get people to ask you questions and engage with your material outside of the office? And the answer to that question is, in the exact same way you get people to engage with you at the office. Meaning, you need to make people feel safe to learn rather than afraid to fail. Right? So you need people to feel like if they ask you a question, they're not going to be embarrassed or lose face. You need to make people feel like if they call you with an issue or to discuss, you're going to be glad they called. The technical term for this is psychological safety. I'm sure it's a term that's familiar to many of you. But what I want to do is illustrate the term for you by telling you a story that involves actual law librarians. And the story involves my first summer of law school. So I think 15 years ago, in 2005, I spent my first summer of law school working at a big law firm in Calgary, Alberta. And as part of the summer associate orientation, they took us on a tour of the library. And it looks kind of like this picture here. And of course, as part of the tour, they introduced us to the librarians. And they said, these are our librarians are amazing. They're very generous. They're very smart. You should use them as a resource. They're here to help you. And then the lawyer who was giving the tour made a joke. She said, our librarians have forgotten more law than you'll ever learn. And I'm sure that's true. But it was also super intimidating, right? You want me as a first-year summer to ask my stupid questions to these wise librarians? I'm not doing that. And so what happened was I distinctly remember the next week being in my office and having to like stoke myself up to go down to the library and ask a question, right? Trying to pump myself up. And of course, once I did it, it was great, right? The librarians were very generous. They were very patient. We got the answer. It was terrific. And the next time I went back, I was a little bit less nervous. And the next time, less nervous every time. And eventually, after a week or so, it was no problem, right? I stopped worrying. Point being, it takes time for people to feel safe, right? In particular, it takes a series of positive interactions with you before people feel safe to ask questions and share their uncertainty. Right? And most importantly, that time, all else equal, will be much longer in a virtual environment. Because most of the ways, or a lot of the ways that we express appreciation and respect are nonverbal, right? I can't see you smile over the phone. So what are some things we can do to move this along, right? To get people feel safer, quicker, virtually. So I think there are 3 things you can do, at least 3 things you can do. The first thing you can do is you can tell people why their questions are important. Okay, so for example, at the beginning of a webinar, especially if everybody has their camera off, you should say to people, you know, in a regular setting, in a live setting, I could see everybody, see your questions, but I can't see you here. So it's extra important for you to say if you don't understand or if you have a question, right? Even just type a question mark into the chat. I know that's asking people to step up a bit early on in their time here, but it's really important for this to go well, right? When you tell people exactly why their questions matter, they feel safer asking at least those specific kinds of questions. So that's the first thing you can do. The second thing you can do is you can excavate people's uncertainty, right? So if you're doing a webinar, you can say to people after you finish teaching something, does that make sense? Yes or no, right? Or I'm hearing a lot of radio silence. Is that a problem? Okay? This assumes the group is small enough for you to have sort of one-on-one or regular interactions. But something else you can do is you can be proactive about reaching out to people, right? So let's say you do a training at your office one day, and then the next day you might just like wander down to where the associates are and ask them how it's going, right? With the stuff that you trained them on. Of course, you can't do this in a virtual environment, but what you can do is call people. So maybe that's something that you want to do. Also, you can be explicit about how people should reach out to you, right? So again, in a virtual setting, or excuse me, in a live setting, if people have questions, they can just wander into the library and ask you questions. In a virtual setting, if you want people to call you with questions, you should tell them to call with questions. Yeah. So that's the second thing. The third thing you can try and do is narrate your appreciation. Right? So if somebody asks you a question, you need to say, great question, thanks for asking. If somebody shares an uncertainty or a thought, you need to say, good thinking, I'm glad you said that. If somebody calls you with a question and you talk through the issue with them, at the end of the call, you should say, that was a great call, I'm really glad you reached out. Which might seem a little bit silly and precious, but remember, the appreciative look on your face can't speak for itself. Okay, it's time for another exercise, and then we'll answer some more questions, and then we'll wrap things up. So the exercise is very simple. What I would love for you to do is just take 3 minutes, wherever you're sitting, and think through some of the ways that you are proactive about getting people to engage, right? So what are some ways that you tell your lawyers their questions are important? What are some ways that you excavate their uncertainty, discover where they have questions? And what are some ways that you narrate your appreciation for their engagement? Right, so take 3 minutes, make a few notes. Again, this just sort of stimulates ideas for subsequent discussion. I'm going to go check out the chat, and we'll come back, and we'll answer some more questions, and then wrap it up. Okay, I'll see you in 3 minutes. Hi, and we're back. As we start to bring our attention, sorry, I've advanced the slides here. As we start to bring our attention back to the screen, let me answer some of the questions that we had come over the chat. I think this is maybe my favorite question of all time, or more of a suggestion. Somebody suggested that one way to kind of disarm students and let them know that it's okay to make errors, they're not fatal, especially when it involves virtual training, is that you can purposely make spelling mistakes in your own slides to show them that the world isn't going to end. That's just, I love that. I'm never going to do that, but that's definitely a good idea. I thought that was really great. Thank you for sharing that question. Another question that came in, actually a couple of questions are sort of on this theme, and this is the last one I'll answer. If I don't get to your question, I'm gonna send responses by email to Lexis, and so they'll be sure to send those out to you because there were a lot of good questions. The last one has to do with engaging a webinar or doing a webinar with lots of people. So anywhere from more than 20, or somebody wrote in more than 5,000 people are on this person's webinar. So this is a really great question, and that is a terrific challenge. So what I would say about this, or the way I would think about this is, how would you do it in a live setting? So if you think about, imagine you're doing a live training to a room of 5,000 people, right? How would you deal with engagement in that setting? So one thing you could do is you could have assistants run around the audience with microphones trying to get people to talk. But that's probably not great. 5,000 people is a lot of people. Another thing you could do is you could have people text or email questions to like a moderator or to you, and then at the end of the session, you could like sit down in one of those panel discussion situations and ask the questions. So that's one way to handle it, which is actually exactly what we're doing here, right? To have people just pump their questions into the chat, and then for you to carve out specific segments of time during the session for you to answer people's questions. So that's one thing I would sort of favor. The other thing to think about is the trade-off between resources and level of support. So if you have 5,000 people and even 1% of those people asks a question, that's I think 50 questions, which is a lot of questions. And so let's say you answer 5 or 10 of those on the call, that means you have 40 to follow up with after. And so it is definitely possible to send 40 emails answering questions, and that's an amazing level of engagement. The question is that a good use of your time, right? Do you have the resources to support that level of engagement? If yes, great. If not, also fine. Right? I think this is just the calculus or the way to think about this kind of an issue. Those are great questions. Thank you so much, everybody. Briefly, I've made for you here a summary of everything that we've talked about today. So this is a toolkit summarizing everything we've covered in one page. LexisNexis is going to send this out to you as a handout. If you think this is helpful, I would encourage you to just print it off. If it's on an 8.5 by 11 sheet, put it on your desk or your coffee table, wherever you're working these days. And it'll just it sort of saves you from having to constantly get out the presentation every time. And that's everything I want to share with you today. This is my contact info if you're interested. Find me on LinkedIn. I am a prolific sharer of professional development content and videos. And with that, I will turn it back over to Eric to give out free money. Have at it, Eric.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. I now understand why you asked me to leave my camera on for the duration of the session. I also understand why I found it disorienting, awkward, but strangely engaging all at the same time. Lots of great questions, as you noted in the chat, certainly more than we could get to answer live today, but we will try and reply in writing to all of those questions. And I want to let everyone know as well that we will be distributing a link to the recording of this session and Chris's materials to all of you later on as well.